required for these microorganisms. However, it is also required for them a good nutritional diet. And just about every macro and micronutrient that these microorganisms require will be found in the feedstock which they're decomposing. There are typically just two nutrients, carbon and nitrogen, that we need to purposely control. That is, provide or combine our feedstocks and recipes that create a balance of carbon, which is required for energy by the organisms, and nitrogen, which is required for amino acids and proteins in order to build new cells. So this balance of about 25 to 1 to 30 to 5 to 1 is what the professional composters aim for in order to perform real composting. Many of us, including myself, compost in our backyard, and likely we don't subscribe to these recipes because we sort of just decompose our materials away to keep it out of the landfill. It would certainly be more favorable to the process if in fact we can even at home combine these products in the right proportions. So again, high carbon to nitrogen, and the carbon materials, as we see illustrated by the brown leaf at the bottom, are those that are more carbonaceous leaves, woody wastes, sawdust. And the high nitrogen or low carbon nitrogen materials are food wastes, grass clippings, manure, biosolids, these kinds of high nitrogen materials. So how does composting occur? At the beginning, we will create this recipe and ensure that the carbon-nitrogen ratio and water and oxygen are all appropriately adjusted. And we may have a beginning temperature of about 68 degrees, our ambient temperature outside. And within a short period of time, that temperature begins to rise as the microorganisms break down the material, respire, and release heat, which would then be held in the pile. This early phase is known as the mesophilic stage. It's the temperatures below 105 degrees Fahrenheit. And then as the temperature rises, it goes into what we call a thermophilic stage, or that higher temperature of greater than 105 degrees. Why is this thermophilic stage important? It's a stage at which organisms are selected for their activity. So the mesophiles, which are responsible for the early decomposition, begin to go dormant, and the previously dormant thermophiles awaken and then begin to degrade the material at these higher temperatures. And we could see these temperatures in this slide going up to over 140, 150 degrees. Now we have these hills and valleys with the temperatures eventually going back down to ambient temperature. And the reason for the slow decline over time are the loss of this bioactive carbon. These microbes are energized by all this carbon, and they're creating a lot of heat. But as this bioactive carbon declines, the heat that they create declines. And when all the bioactive carbon is down to some ambient or lower stage, we say the composting process is done. And that might be what we call the curing stage or the maturation stage. Now there's a special temperature, 131 degrees Fahrenheit, that professional composters must achieve for certain times in order to ensure that pathogens, human pathogens, other animal pathogens that might be found in manures, and plant pathogens on our tomato plants and our other vegetation are destroyed, and weed seeds are destroyed. So in our backyard, many of us don't achieve 131 degrees for the number of days that's required. And it's likely that as we apply our so-called finished compost, we see germination of tomato seeds, and we might even have a plant pathogen that stays in the mix that reinfects. So there are a number of different methods of composting. The lower right, this vessel, this green box, is a container system, and we see these used for smaller amounts of compost at institutions such as schools, prisons, and those places that are found largely in urban or suburban areas, because we don't want the odors from the decomposing material to be a nuisance. So these are closed containers that perform composting within a closed system. We have something called aerated static pile, whereas instead of turning the pile, we actually create the pile of homogeneous feedstock on perforated pipes through which we use a fan to blow air. The air will then dissipate heat and oxygenate the pile. The method of composting that's most common is that the windrow, and that's shown in the bottom left, where a windrow turner of some sort regularly mixes our materials. This is the most forgiving of all the methods. If you get excessive water, or you need to add additional materials, or you could just run your windrow turner through it again and continue to mix it until you have completed the process. So what do we use the finished product for? So many different things. I can't even begin to fill up the screen on this slide, but I'll show you a few. In our urban environment, we see land that has been disturbed by removing topsoil, compacting the remaining subsoil, as shown by this housing development here. The addition of compost and organic matter to this provides improved soil physical properties and some slow release nutrients. We can also use it as a filtering agent in these filter socks that we see. And there you see a silt fence that has not done its job. It's permitted silt from a construction site to move out into the road. And these filter socks filled with compost will actually screen out clay, other particulates, and sometimes some heavy metals and other nutrients. We have rain gardens and bioretention cells to collect stormwater, and compost is used as an ingredient in those media in order to enable plants to grow well. It can be used in agriculture, but typically large-scale agriculture is normally practiced, cannot afford the cost of compost. So we see it's normally relegated to the use in specialty farms and organic farms, or as a mulch in orchards, or as a blanket on hillsides of newly constructed sites. This is a compost blanket that's used to prevent stormwater from eroding soil on this site. It can be used as a top dressing for turf grass, can be used to replace pine bark and peat in nursery industry or in the greenhouse industry. In addition to all the benefits the compost as a product has, the process itself of composting for creating these amendments has some value in greenhouse gas production and climate change. So if we were to take our normal wastes and compost them and use them in the soil, previous research, as cited here, has shown the savings in metric tons of carbon equivalent per ton of organic input that would be saved instead of mining fertilizers and using them instead on land. So just to summarize benefits of composting, the process itself reduces the volume of the original feedstock. It improves handling and storage of the material. It produces a Class A material. That's a material that's very low or devoid of pathogens and weed seeds. Creates a beneficial product, and there are potential tipping fees. Unfortunately, those do not help the municipalities as much as they help, say, private composters who are getting paid often by municipalities to take the material and then compost. And with that, I'll turn the podium over to the next speaker.
Thank you. Well, my name is Blake Bensman. I'm the Sustainability Manager for Virginia Tech Dining Services, as well as Housing Residence Life. I focus on things with food systems and sustainability, student living and sustainability, but if we focus on compost specifically, our Virginia Tech composting within the dining services is really looking beyond the plate. You know, where does your waste go? A lot of the times, you know, you take it for granted. You go and get a meal, and once you're done with it, you put your waste on a conveyor and call it good. We've really taken proactive steps as dining services to look at that and compost those types of things. Just to start off here, Royal Oak Farm is our third-party composter that we use with Virginia Tech Dining Services. I'll dive into that in a little bit, but as you can see here, we compost food scraps. That's anything from pre-consumer, so when we chop up vegetables for our grab-and-go items, or even when we get food scrap items from students after they're done with their meals, we put that in as well. So before I go into dining services, I wanted to give an overview of just some things Virginia Tech is doing. Composting and waste reduction and all those types of things are really a part of our climate action commitment. We had a really exciting opportunity to have a subcommittee that specifically focuses on waste reduction, compost, recycling, and everything in between. And we had a couple different strategies that we're thinking about using with our climate action commitment. Before I go into that, though, I want to talk about why waste is important, just to kind of size it up for you. So as an institution, you know, we look at different other respected institutions all throughout the country. 55 of 65 Power 5 schools are using waste minimization as a metric for sustainable dining. 13 of 15 ACC schools are doing that, so Atlantic Coast Conference schools. So that's an interesting stat. And 33% of food waste produced in the world is wasted annually. So just think again, beyond your plate, what goes into the scraps. And then 22 million pounds are wasted each year, with the average college student contributing to about 142 pounds of food waste. So that's after every meal. You know, you go to class, you throw something in the compost, or some food that goes wasted in a mini fridge. All that compiles together. So diving specifically into the Virginia Tech side of this, we had a subcommittee focused specifically on waste and recycling and composting. We have a couple different strategies that we're thinking about aiming at. Once we get the climate action commitment going again in terms of subcommittees, we'll start some ideation about how do we tackle zero waste. But specifically with dining services, we're doing a lot of things to already help that zero waste scenario. Here's a couple things that the university is looking at. So reducing waste to landfill for students by 25% by 2020, increasing our recycling rates. There's also talk about a potential composting facility. So lots of ideation going on, but I think it's really great as a university community. You know, we're looking at student input, faculty, staff, to really try to reduce our footprint that way. I wanted to focus specifically on dining services though. Like I said, waste minimization is one of our priorities. For the last 11 years, dining services has sent more than 11 million pounds of food waste and biodegradable material packaging to our third-party composter. So you might think of food, but another big focus that we have of composting is our packaging waste. We got rid of styrofoam in all of our dining centers in 2014, and we only use compostable for the most part, at least. There are some items that do require the food to be warmer, that we do have to put it in a plastic that's heat tolerant. But we're really progressing through that and trying to evaluate what kinds of materials that we use. And as you can see, we do plastics and cardboard recycling, and we also divert a good portion of our food to different sources so that food can be used for food insecurity purposes, and also looking at local food banks. So just wanted to give you a pretty big number. Looking at that 11 million and converting that to pounds, that's about 500 tons of organic waste each year that we send to Evington, where our Royal Oak Farm composter is. And that's 5,000 tons of organic waste since 2009. Compare that to so many different things, and that's a big impact for us, and we hope to do even better moving forward. But I'll transition to Carol, so talk a little bit about some other things with composting.
Hi, everybody. I'm Carol Davis. I'm the Sustainability Manager for the town of Blacksburg. And I think the reason I'm here is really to respond to the question that Anne was receiving at the Sustainable Blacksburg booth during stepping out. And what we hear about frequently in the community is, I would like to compost. I don't know how. I don't know what my opportunities are. So that's what I'm going to talk to you all a little bit about. And to start off, it's not necessarily bad news, but it's a little bit of reality check about what opportunities we have and some of the constraints and challenges we have as a locality to being able to, for instance, provide curbside municipal composting. I think that's a question that we get fairly often. So a couple of things. Blake mentioned the Royal Oak Farms facility, which is a commercial composting facility that is located in Evington, which is right outside of Lynchburg. Realistically, it's not going to be possible financially, logistically, or even environmentally for us to ship collected compost from Blacksburg to there in terms of just the environmental fossil fuel impact. And I would say it's fair to say that Virginia Tech is also recognizing that that's an unsustainable solution for them. It's a stopgap solution, but really what is needed is to have a commercial composting facility that is located within the New River Valley, maybe even Montgomery County. And there are some ongoing conversations because the town and the university both have some ambitious climate and sustainability goals. Having that kind of a facility situated in our region would go a long way towards doing that. The other, I would say that another challenge, I don't know that I would rank these in terms of biggest, or if these are all big challenges to overcome, is actually the density and the demographics of Blacksburg. No surprise to anyone, we're a college town, right? Which means that we're about 70% renter occupied, with the vast majority of those folks living in multifamily housing. There is not a path forward to feasibly collect largely food waste from folks living in apartments, space considerations. Another thing is we cannot compel property owners to provide that. We're not, and that actually leads into my third point, which is raise your hand if you have heard of what a Dillon's rule state is. Okay, other than my panelists have heard of this. In the United States, states are either home rule or Dillon's rule. About half of them are Dillon's rule. What a Dillon rule state means is you're a mother may I state. So you have to get your General Assembly or your legislative body of your state to enable something that you want to do locally. An example might be a plastic bag ban or a plastic bag tax. I guess another question I get frequently, why doesn't Blacksburg ban plastic bags? We have to seek one, agreement across the state that this is what's needed and get the General Assembly to pass a law. It's often a pretty heavy lift. It is not impossible, but you need to have enough localities who see this as a priority to go take a run at the General Assembly and say, we need enabling legislation to allow us to compel multifamily housing to have composting facilities for their residents. I don't see a lot of folks necessarily clamoring for that, and so that's not likely to happen in the short term. And quite frankly, if we don't have, well, one, we actually don't have the density of the population density that would support commercial composting collection, regardless of the students. But if we don't have the students and the student housing on board, there's no way to make it work. So that's all a huge bummer. Sorry, that's just the reality of where we're at right now. But there are opportunities, right? I think that the residential composting, municipal collection rather of residential composting is not likely to come anytime soon. But if we were to have a commercial composting facility somewhere situated, there is a lot of opportunity from grocery stores and restaurants. So I think that is a thing we would very much like to tackle in the coming years. I won't get into this whole thing too, but I think Dr. Evanylo knows a lot about the permitting and siting challenges of a commercial composting facility, or even just a collection site in the community. We're kind of finding, like, for instance, farms have a great deal of leeway and agricultural operations about composting the food waste that's generated on site, but they can't similarly be a collection site for the community. It seems like that would be a great path forward. but the health department gets real rung up when you start to take that. So there's just sort of obstacles in our way to making this happen locally. So with that, I'm going to shift off of the bad news or the reality check, because I think you guys want to hear some good news. So where do we go from here, right? We've mentioned that Blacksburg and Virginia Tech have ambitious climate goals and other sustainability goals that they want to advance. Also, Virginia Tech, it really is facing down an imperative to deal with its nutrient management imperatives in terms of less the dining hall waste, but the animal waste from its agricultural operations. And so they're kind of in a have to deal with it situation. And we're happy to jump on the coattails of their have to situation so we can do our want tos. So I think that going forward, I would be surprised if in the next 10 years, we don't have some sort of a facility that will start to meet both of our needs. So with that, let's talk about some options for residents. And I break that down into kind of 3 broad categories: folks who own their own home and land, renters, and then folks who are living on campus. First of all, if you have a space that you control, your own yard, you can do this. It's not that complicated. I think Dr. Evanylo did a great job of laying out the science, which can be kind of complex, but also gave you the message that that's at the commercial scale, but at the residential scale, there's far less complexity. It's a lot more forgiving. You can mess it up for sure, but it's not the end of the world. So, you know, if you're roughly getting a 2-to-1 carbon to nitrogen or brown to green ratio, you're not going to get in too much trouble. Turn it to aerate. P.S. I never do this. I'm the laziest composter in the world. I don't pay attention to ratios really. I never, ever, ever turn it. More or less I do a layer cake method where I'm throwing in the green wet stuff and I cover it with brown stuff till I more or less can't see the green stuff anymore. That's my ratio. I don't water it. I don't fool with it. I'm a little casual sometimes. I'll throw some dairy in there. So like I'm telling you, I've been doing this for, you know, more than 2 decades with no problems. The occasional, like, you know, raccoon gets in there, it's fine. So I don't want you to be afraid to try to compost at home. Yes, there's a ton of science behind it, but it's completely doable. I would be remiss if I didn't note that we all have a lot of potential organic waste heading to the landfill at the end of this month. If you've got pumpkins, definitely do what you can to compost that. And provided these bullet points for us. But yeah, it's like 30 to 40% of food. Okay, yeah. Half of U.S. households will decorate with pumpkins. That's a lot of organic waste going to landfills, which is a bummer. But we all love Halloween. So I'll also just note that I could stand up here, as could Greg, as could Blake, and talk about the particularities of how to compost at home. But you know, it's really, YouTube is your friend in all of these things. If you've ever tried to fix something in your house or do something, it's your friend. So you can go in there and say, how do I compost in a small yard with clay soils? There will be a video for you, right? Or whatever is your particular situation. So I won't talk at you. You can go find that for yourself. And I'll close with this. Because we are a community that is 70% renter occupied, what can those folks do? And I tip my hat to my friends and colleagues in Sustainable Blacksburg, because they really spearheaded getting adoption of share waste in this region. And all of that is just a neighbor to neighbor willing to help folks receive. And so you can sign up to be a host, which means that you've got enough space in your yard that you're willing to partner with folks in the community and accept their compostable material or their food scraps. And you can, it's just a person to person, you work it out. I mean, Anne has been really, really active with it. I think you've got a bucket at the end of your driveway and folks can come and leave what they want. And it's been working beautifully. And I know there are a number of folks in the community who are doing that. We really hope to grow that. So if you are a person who would be interested in that, I think you just get on the Share Waste app and you input your information. I did it so long ago, I don't remember what I did.
You can just sign up using your Google account or your Facebook account, or just create an account and share it.
Okay, yeah. So that's been really neat. And I don't know if we have any metrics on how many folks have engaged with that, but
I meant to look that up. I think we have about 8 hosts in Blacksburg, and then we have several in Christiansburg too. I know some of them are single Blacksburg board members who live in Christiansburg, but anyway, since we kind of pushed it out there, we have at least kind of a dozen hosts in the area, and we probably have 50 or 60 connections that we've made. I know I've had like a dozen people, and I know somebody else has like 16 people. Now, not everybody continues with it, but anyway, there are a lot of people dropping off ways to our.
Yeah, and that's just a great way to just build community too. I really love that. And so I'll close with this. We elected to not talk at you the whole time, but the world of composting is vast and there's a lot of cousins to composting. So we decided not to tell you about all of these things, but just to note that there are different flavors here. Mine is the lazy composting, which is not really composting, it's just landfill diversion. There's the true composting, there's vermiculture, there's anaerobic digestion, and pyrolysis biochar. All of these have different kind of pros, cons, environmental benefits, climate benefits. Our resident expert is here. I encourage you to pepper him with questions if any of these things particularly intrigues you. But with that, we will close it out and open it up for questions.
Do we want to place this centrally?
Okay. Yes, sir.
So I'm curious now, does that, if you add charcoal or biochar to a compost pile, does that count as bioavailable carbon for that CN ratio, or is that less accessible to the microbes?
So repeat the question so the folks at home.
So the question is the carbon in biochar a bioactive, bioavailable form of carbon for the microorganisms? And while it may be to some extent, one of the advantages of biochar as a source of carbon to sequester is the fact that it doesn't break down very much, which means microorganisms in the soil do not degrade it very quickly. So historically, back millennia, indigenous people in South America had created biochar added to soils and improved their soils, and we can still see signatures of that carbon today, meaning it hasn't degraded, meaning microorganisms in the compost pile do not readily, it shouldn't be part of the act of leaves and sawdust and other carbon.
Do you want to explain a little bit the 101 of biochar for folks who may not be aware of it?
Sure. So biochar is like granulated carbon, and it is these days created through a process called pyrolysis, which is an energy creating method in which organic materials such as certain woody wastes, could be manures, just about any organic waste that one might compost, you could also pyrolyze. And pyrolysis involves the combustion of these materials under high pressure and low oxygen. So instead of totally ashing your material, it ends up with little charcoal material, and it creates gases and oils that can be removed and used in secondary energy processes. So pyrolysis units have been developed to create oils and gases that could be used as an energy source, and the end product is this granulated carbon, very fine material, which has great recalcitrance. You put it in the soil and it doesn't degrade, and it's being promoted as a way to help sequester carbon in the soil.
And I'll add on to that point that my colleagues who are sort of sustainability directors across the US are very interested in the potential of biochar for carbon sequestration. A lot of us have really ambitious climate goals to get to net zero by 2050, but we're also, for those of you who were at the presentation last night, the Kiss the Ground presentation, they were really emphasizing it's not enough for us to just reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We have to actively remove carbon, atmospheric carbon, and that legacy carbon in the atmosphere from fossil fuel combustion. And this is something that my colleagues are super excited about as a potential path forward.
So I'd also like to add to that in that biochar should never be generated for the purpose of just producing biochar. The economics do not make sense, but if you can generate biochar secondarily by creating some other energy compound, gas, during the process of pyrolysis, then the economics make sense. But we need not to get hung up on this idea that we want to pyrolyze everything just to create biochar, unless we're actually getting some energy from this also.
Mm-hmm.
I have a follow-up question.
Go ahead.
Can you talk a little bit about if the carbon in bugs are not really available in microbes? What are the benefits to the soil in terms of fertility?
Sure. So first I'll say that just like compost.
Repeat the question real quick.
Oh, thank you.
Yep.
So the question is, what is the value of biochar to the soil if the carbon in the biochar is not available to the soil microbes? And I'd like to first say, just like composts and manures and other organic materials, all biochars are not the same. Whether they're made from woody wastes or sludges, like paper mill sludges, or food waste or some other product, they're also created at different temperatures and pressures. And so the finished product will have different characteristics, beneficial characteristics. Some of them can be a source of nutrients, not so much nitrogen, but nutrients such as the phosphorus and potassium and calcium, and then micronutrients such as zinc and copper, micronutrients and macronutrients that are required by plants. The other benefit is the physical improvement of a soil. So when you add biochar to the soil, it can improve what we call soil aggregation, the ability of soil to form discrete aggregates, enabling air and water to flow, as opposed to compacted soil. It could relieve the compaction the way that we often see in our urban soils when we manage them, when we remove topsoil and then build new housing or other kind of units there. So it has physical benefits and chemical benefits. And another chemical benefit would be in some soils in which we have pollutants. They could be metal pollutants like lead, or organic pollutants like we hear PFAS and phthalates and other organic pollutants that are in the news. They can bind and make less available some of those pollutants depending on the specific properties of the biochar.
We actually have a couple of related questions on the chat about that. One is from Stephanie asking, how do I use chicken coop bedding or coop for compost? They have about 80% pine shavings and 20% chicken coop, and they tried for about a year, but it did not break down.
So please repeat the last part, the last statement.
80% pine shavings,
yes,
and 20% of chicken coop.
Mm-hmm.
And they tried for a year, but it did not break down.
Okay. So animal manures are an interesting group of products because different animals have poop or manure in them of different quality, meaning different amounts of nitrogen. The amount of nutrients in them are determined by the animal's ability to pull nutrients out of the food and use it in their body or excrete it. And some animals, like beef cattle and dairy cattle, do a better job of pulling out nutrients, and poultry do a worse job. And so there's a lot of nitrogen, more nitrogen in those, and more phosphorus in those materials. Then once the materials are not only the manure, but bedded in some way, and bedding is a carbon source that may be used for the animals to poop on. And sometimes they poop directly on a solid surface, so there's no additional wood shavings or sawdust or wood chips, and sometimes there's a lot of it. So if there are if there's more bedding, more wood shavings, it's going to change the carbon nitrogen ratio of that material. So getting back a little bit to the science of this, straight manure might have a carbon nitrogen ratio of 7:1 or 8:1, meaning it's very rich and very hot in nitrogen, whereas bedded materials can range from 10:1 to 20:1. So how you mix that material with other carbon sources is going to determine how much your ideal recipe. So you need to know to some extent what the carbon nitrogen ratio is. But if these, I don't know if these people they're doing it on a farm, I guess, they're not living in town with chickens, I'm guessing.
They might very well be.
Okay. Okay. But so that of course matters, because it depends on what the size of the compost pile you could build is. For in-town backyard composting and even some on-farm backyard composting, what I find is often the most limiting factor is the size of the pile. So you need a pile at least 1 cubic yard, 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, in order to create enough insulation that the heat will rise and the decomposition will occur. And larger piles are even more advantageous, because eventually that pile is going to break down and become smaller and be able to hold heat less well. You also need to make sure that the moisture content is correct. Too high a moisture content suffocates the microorganisms by filling the air pores up with water, and too low water content does not provide enough moisture. So we typically want to see less than 60% moisture. So in a pile that weighs 1,000 pounds, you want less than 600 pounds of water and 400 pounds and more than 400 pounds of dry matter. But you don't want it less than 45% moisture. It'll be too dry. So if you're actually actively composting and they're creating heat and losing water, there's a chance that your pile may become too dry, and you need then to add water to it. Most of the backyard composters, like Carol and myself, we have far too little material, and I turn it, even though the recipe isn't ideal. And I know over time it's going to decompose. But water, keeping it turned and aerated, making the pile large enough, combining the materials in the correct recipe. And if the people on Zoom wish to speak to me one-on-one, they can contact me at my office at home, and I'll be glad to talk to them.
We had a question here. Yeah.
If I want to start composting at home, does the kitchen waste need to be organic? My concern is I have an old growth in my backyard, and I don't know how that will affect.
So you're saying you have an old growth forest or stand of trees near your home, and your concern is, if you want to start composting at home, is it necessary or more beneficial for the for the inputs, the food waste to be all organic? My initial sense is no, but I'll let Dr. Evanylo, because I certainly don't.
Correct, yes. Organic only in the sense that the feedstock is composed of carbon, not organic in the sense of USDA and other organizations that certify organic producers by eliminating the use of various pesticides. So one of the marvelous things about composting and composting organisms is that they can degrade and decompose even natural toxic organic materials that you might have, not just in your yard waste, but I guarantee all the food that we are eating there's nothing that's virgin with regard to pesticides. Everything has some level of pesticide within it, but you can compost that product, and even organic farmers who compost are not required to have a certified organic source of feedstock in order to have a finished product that they could use on their certified organic gardens. And it's because the process itself removes or sequesters or somehow deactivates almost every kind of pesticide that we know about. There is one group of herbicides which we hear about every year. They are pesticides that work as do plant growth regulators. Picloram is a common one that's used on pastures. Clopyralid is one that's used on lawns. And these materials can be degraded, but they are active at such low concentrations that even with degradation, if that material is used on crops or vegetation that those pesticides are active against, then even at 3, 4, 5 parts per billion, crops like peas and soybeans and some others can be killed. So we hear about nurseries or composters that obtain some material almost every year that the source of the feedstock is unknown and may contain some of these pesticides.
But it sounds like the risk to a mature tree is negligible to zero.
Yeah, for trees, and it's a broadleaf herbicide. So if you were to put it on turf grass or corn or wheat, it would be fine, except that there's the addition of this small amount of pesticide, which would eventually degrade with time.
We have a question from Ingrid online. She asks, one of my bins is overeaten with ants. Is it bad?
The question is, one of her compost bins is overrun with ants.
Yeah.
Is that bad?
Generally, no. What it's an indication of is that it's cool. If your compost pile was 131 to 145 degrees, ants would be incinerated. They would. So we find a lot of, particularly at the end of the composting process, even when a composting pile is adequately maintained and you have the high temperatures, at the end of it, you can get soldier flies and fungi, which don't like high temperatures, and a whole range of other insects. And I wouldn't worry about it. I might worry about termites if you take any of that and place it anywhere near the house, or wood. Wood, if there's a lot of woody products in it, it's a possibility that you could get some termites in it, but I'm not worried. I wouldn't be worried about insects in general.
Thank you. Okay, there are a few questions for Blake from Brad. The first question is, do you accept compostable food service articles along with food scraps like on campus? Why or why not?
Sure. So the question was, do we accept compostable food scraps? It could be from community or wherever else for dining services. We don't at this time. That's mainly just because we're keeping our compost specific to dining services and the food items that could go into that. And we don't want to contaminate that waste because we could have something that contaminates our feedstock that we send on to Royal Oak Farm, and we want to keep that as pure as possible.
And another question is there an industrial composter serving the Blacksburg area?
At this time, no. As I talked about a little bit before, Virginia Tech is exploring having an industrial composter as a part of our climate action commitment, but definitely stay tuned. Lots to come in the next few years.
Can you talk a little bit about compostable plastics? I know they won't break down in a home composter, and I've read that they can't recycle. So I assume they're more expensive. Is there a benefit for businesses in this area when there's no industrial composting to be paying extra for composting?
Yeah. So the question is, can I address the use of compostable plastics? And I'll broaden that to compostable containers, utensils, that sort of thing, because the world of compostable products is so varied. The early type products actually consisted of real plastic interlinked with products from corn so that the interlinkages would break. And what would actually happen is you'd get just fine amounts of plastic in your pile. And it's not really what we consider compostable. If you wish to learn a lot about compostable materials or anything dealing with composting, I would recommend the U.S. Composting Council website, which has information about testing labs and also these kinds of products. The latest materials that they're developing are produced in a way that there's no plastic in them. They're made entirely from plant materials, but the challenges are because they decompose easily. Those that decompose easily may not be appropriate for holding soup or hot coffee, and those that don't decompose or that can hold those would be largely difficult to break down, even though they would in a commercial composting facility. If we have no composting facility in the region, it is a waste to buy these products because they'll still end up in a landfill where they'll quickly decompose to methane and create the same kind of problems that paper will produce. So the ideal world is to have good, fully decomposable utensils and cups, and also have access to a commercial composting facility, or compost them in your backyard composter, in which they'll take a little more time. But if you do like I do, you keep recycling them. At some point you screen them and they break down and they break down. And over the period of several years, you'll eventually decompose them totally.
I can tag on to that only because I'm aware of a study that was performed for the state of California at the time. This is maybe 5 years ago. California was looking to create some laws that would outlaw the use of single-use plastics for certain institutional and restaurant applications. And somebody asked the question, is this a feel-good thing, or is this actually beneficial? And they did a lot of analysis and kind of came to the conclusion that the climate profile of compostable servingware and other containers was worse. So it wasn't meeting goals in terms of climate. There were other potential, benefits in terms of plastic pollution in the ocean. So, it's kind of a mixed bag. And where they landed was ultimately the better path is to foster or move away from a culture of single use, whether or not that single use was plastic or compostable, because neither path is sustainable. And so I think that largely echoes Dr. Evanylo's point. So that's the category of things that maybe feel green, but when you really dive into the science behind it, isn't so green. And I've lost it locked. Sorry, so there was a question for me, and I think I can actually pretty much paraphrase. It was a question that came in over Zoom. Why doesn't the town of Blacksburg? It was almost a word for word reiteration of the question I started my comments with. Why isn't there a requirement for composting for approval of a new apartment complex? So this is a point I hit earlier on. We're a Dillon's Rule state. We have no way to compel apartment complexes to do this. We would have to seek enabling legislation from the state in order to do this. I think from a practical perspective, and I can't recall if I said this, there is physically no space to do that. Back in 2015 or 2016, I did an update of the multifamily apartment recycling ordinance to require that there be essentially a similar level of convenience for folks living in apartments to recycle as there were for folks who had curbside recycling available to them. And that required a lot of thinking about siting of recycling containers within apartment complexes. It was extraordinarily difficult because a lot of the apartment complexes, particularly the ones built in the 80s, 70s, 60s, and before, never conceived of having to site recycling on site. And so just the space considerations of how to fit this in with buildings, parking, and the necessary turning radii to get the trucks in there, it was tough, and we came up with a compromise solution. I can tell you right now, there's not a way to fit it in. There's not a way to fit in composting as well. So that's back to my list of bad news. Sorry, I don't want to end with that, but and I think there was a follow-up question and it's locked again. Can you tell me?
There was just one, does the town of Blacksburg generate leaf mulch for farmers?
Yeah, so the town of Blacksburg, the Public Works Department, the Public Works Director is going to be mad at me. Twice a year, I'm looking at you, Steve, does brush collection. This is a fellow town of Blacksburg employee, so I'm going to call him out. Twice a year. Spring and fall brush collection, so folks can bring their leaves and woody waste and other yard waste stuff out to the curb. The Public Works Department will come collect it. They take it to a facility to be lightly composted. And I believe that the public has an opportunity once a year to go bring their pickup truck or whatever vessel they can pull up and get that. Might have been suspended during COVID. I think that's the case. Yes, I'm getting a nod from the back of the room. I'm sorry I didn't come armed with this question, but yes, that is something that's ongoing. And the town also collaborates with local farmers and brings a lot of woody waste to them directly to be used as soil amendment and row mulching throughout the year. So a lot of that stuff is being reused within the community.
That was a question I had, was can you take that stuff and throw it into your compost bin? Kind of reduce that flow that goes, it's put out on the curb and expectations that the town's going to take care of my problem, take my problem away and put it somewhere else.
Yeah. I mean, I think Dr. Evanylo would back me up on this. I think folks tend to not have enough carbon sources in there. If they're going to make a mistake, it's going to be on the not enough carbon side generally.
So, yeah, so it depends. If your only source of nitrogen are food wastes, but you have lots of leaves and woody brush, then you may have more carbon than, you may not have enough nitrogen to actually get your pile hot. The other problem with brush, I mean, leaves are fine to some extent, But if you've ever had a pile of leaves and you see they sit there a while, they mat, they're very difficult unless they're ground. And the same with woody brush, unless it's reduced in particle size through some kind of grinder, that material will not compost well in your pile. You'll have a brush pile in your compost bin. So we rather it go to the town where they do have a grinder for some size reduction, and people could then use that for mulching. We're hoping that as Virginia Tech moves towards composting, and we have a tremendous need at Tech for carbon sources that we can depend on some of the woody waste from the town to supplement the manure, all the manure that's generated at the farms.
And that's a little bit of a conversation we're going to have because that's of high value to home gardeners and farmers. And so we're going to have a conversation about whether that's going to be a workable deal. Menina, I think we're going to close out with you because we're at time.
So one of the things that I know that we do as home gardeners is most homeowners have a leaf blower. Most homeowners have a leaf blower. The leaf blower has a suction feature as well as the blow feature. We grind all of our leaves, put some in the compost, others around the garden. So like that's just a small thing that we do, and we don't put any leaves out in the garden. We let the kids brush them as much as they want.
Yeah.
Because kids love leaf piles. We also steal our neighbors' leaf piles when they put them on the curb, with their knowledge, of course. So anyway, just something that home gardeners can do because it's really easy. And then, yeah, the town might want my stuff, but maybe they're overrun with everybody else's. So
yeah, and I use them. I just use I have an electric lawnmower with a bag attachment, and I'll just run that over the pile, you know, and it mulches it very effectively.
Yeah. And I can tell you, some of us really need, I don't have very many leaves, so one of the people who brought waste to me through the share waste gave me like 8 giant bags of leaves. And I have used all of those because I can't, I have not nearly enough carbon really for myself, but definitely not now. And all these other people are bringing me lots of nitrogen. So that's a way to, also get your leaves.
Yeah.
Just another quick question from Ellen. They're asking, how do town folk access the mulch leaves the town of Blacksburg creates?
I would say go to the Town of Blacksburg website and look under the Public Works tab. It's almost assuredly going to be there. But if not, you can shoot me an email and just sustainability@blacksburg.gov. The question was how do you know how to access the lightly composted leaves? But sustainability@blacksburg.gov, I can point you in the right direction.
Yeah, that's a good question because I asked about that. And I was told that was discontinued.
I think it was just a COVID discontinue. Was it before? Okay, I can find out. Yeah. Okay.
And with that, I think we'll close out. The library cannot appreciate enough the work that Sustainable Blacksburg does, and thank you panelists for coming. And thank you all for joining us and the folks online. We love that you guys love this program so much. It's a great partnership for us. So next month, you've already mentioned what it is. Dan, you want to say it one more time? Sure. On November 17th, we'll have the surprising cost of food waste and what we can do about it with past church with the campus kitchen that Greg mentioned earlier. So please come back to that. Join us here or online. Yes. And thank you, panelists, so much. Thank you. And for those of you who are here, there are a few native trees that are left. I would love to find homes for them. 2 maples are left for the pine, a walnut, and 2 oaks.
Nice.